What happens when an undercover CEO steps into his own company and finds a nightmare? Employees mistreated, safety ignored, and a manager running the store through fear. But this CEO isn't here to watch. He's here to change everything. From witnessing abuse firsthand to taking down a toxic leader, this story proves that real leadership isn't about power. It's about protecting the people who keep the business running. Stay tuned as we dive into the shocking reality of what happens when a CEO goes undercover and exposes the truth. Daniel Shaw had built his career on turning struggling businesses around, but something was deeply wrong with his home improvement retail chain. Over the past year, complaints had been piling up, customers frustrated with long waits, inventory mismanagement causing lost sales, and, worst of all, employees reporting toxic leadership at several locations. At first, Daniel had trusted his district managers to handle the issues. But the more he investigated, the more he realized that problems weren't being fixed. Reports of store managers mistreating employees, ignoring safety regulations, and cutting corners on customer service made it clear he couldn't rely on second-hand information. If he wanted the truth, he had to see it for himself. Unlike many executives, Daniel wasn't the type to sit in an office and hope things improved. He had built his company from the ground up, starting in the very same retail warehouses his employees worked in now. He knew firsthand what a good work environment should feel like, and he was about to find out just how badly things had fallen apart. He selected one of the worst-performing locations in the company, a mid-sized store in a struggling suburb. Customer reviews were brutal, and employee turnover was alarmingly high. If the reports were true, this was a store on the brink of collapse. To get the unfiltered experience, Daniel disguised himself as Ben, a middle-aged warehouse worker with a rough past and no corporate experience. He changed his usual sharp business attire for worn-out jeans, a faded company polo, and a cap that hid his well-groomed hair. He even added a slight limp to reinforce his character as someone looking for a second chance. With a fabricated resume that listed years of factory work, he applied for an entry-level stockroom associate position. Getting hired was surprisingly easy. The store was so desperate for staff that they barely checked his background, handing him a schedule without much introduction. The first red flag was how disorganized the hiring process was. No training session, no tour of the store, just a quick rundown of tasks before being sent to work. That alone told Daniel this location was neglected from the top down. As he walked into the store for his first shift, he could tell immediately that something was off. Customers wandered the aisles looking confused, struggling to find employees to help them. Shelves were in disarray, stocked with mismatched products or left half empty. The energy among employees was tense, almost robotic. People moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, as if they were just trying to survive the shift rather than work together. Then Daniel saw him, Todd, the store manager. The man stood near the front of the store, arms crossed, watching employees like a predator. Within minutes, Daniel witnessed Todd snapping at a cashier, correcting him in front of customers with a tone dripping in condescension. The employee, a young kid who couldn't have been older than 18, mumbled an apology and rushed to fix his mistake. Todd barely acknowledged it before turning away, already moving toward his next target. Daniel clenched his jaw. If this was just the first impression, the next few days were going to be worse than he thought. Daniel adjusted his cap and stepped into the stockroom, blending in with the other employees as best as he could. The back area was just as chaotic as the sales floor, with half-open boxes piled up, inventory scattered haphazardly, and a few exhausted workers moving like they were running on autopilot. There was no organization, no labels, no system for restocking, just a free-for-all where employees were expected to figure it out themselves. It was clear that no one had been properly trained, and from the way they rushed through their tasks, they were afraid of taking too long. "New guy?" a deep voice asked from behind. Daniel turned to see Luis, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with tired eyes and grease stains on his uniform. He was the warehouse supervisor, though from the way he moved, he was clearly doing the work of 3 people. He barely glanced at Daniel as he handed him a scanning device. "Name?" "Ben," Daniel answered, keeping his voice casual. Luis grunted, clearly unimpressed. "Welcome to hell, Ben." Before Daniel could respond, Todd, the store manager, stormed in. His presence made the entire stockroom tense up. "Luis, why is there still a pallet of appliances sitting here? Get your guys moving!" Todd barked, completely ignoring the fact that Luis was already scrambling to keep up with the workload. He didn't bother offering any help, just hovered like a vulture, waiting for someone to mess up so he could pounce. Daniel noticed that no one spoke back to Todd. Even Luis, a man who had clearly been here for years, just muttered a clipped "yes, sir" and kept working. The fear in the air was palpable. This wasn't leadership, it was intimidation. Daniel's first task was to unload a truck of new inventory, but there was no clear system. When he asked another worker where to put things, he got a shrug. "Just find a spot," the guy said. That explained the cluttered mess on the shelves outside. Todd was clearly more focused on shouting orders than actually running an efficient operation. After 2 hours of hauling heavy boxes with no breaks, no instructions, and no acknowledgement from management, Daniel stepped onto the sales floor to get a better sense of how things operated outside the stockroom. He immediately spotted Nick, the young cashier from earlier, struggling at the register. A long line of impatient customers had formed, and he fumbled with scanning items, his hands shaking slightly. Todd stood nearby, watching but offering no help. "Speed it up, Nick, this isn't a daycare," Todd snapped, loud enough for customers to hear. Nick's face flushed red as he tried to work faster, but his panic made him even clumsier. Daniel could already see what was happening. This wasn't just bad management, it was a toxic cycle of fear. Employees were so worried about getting yelled at that they were making more mistakes, which only gave Todd more reasons to berate them. This store wasn't just inefficient, it was a pressure cooker, ready to explode. And Daniel was about to turn up the heat. It didn't take long for Daniel to realize that fear, not efficiency, ran this store. Every worker he observed moved with hesitation, constantly glancing over their shoulders as if bracing for another round of verbal abuse. Todd didn't just demand results, he expected perfection without providing any real guidance. Employees were thrown into tasks without training, expected to figure things out on their own, and when they made mistakes, they were publicly humiliated instead of corrected. Daniel saw this firsthand when he was helping organize the back storage area. Nick, the young cashier, had been pulled off the register and reassigned to stocking shelves, a job he clearly had no experience in. He struggled to lift a heavy box of ceramic tiles, his arms shaking under the weight. "Come on, Nick." Todd's voice echoed through the aisle. "Do you need a step-by-step manual to carry a box? Hurry up before we all die of old age." Nick's face turned red, but he kept quiet, biting his lip as he struggled to balance the box. He finally got it onto the shelf, but in his rush, he stacked it improperly. Daniel barely had time to react before the tiles tipped forward, shattering across the floor in a loud crash. The entire store seemed to freeze. Todd stormed over, his expression a mix of fury and disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped, gesturing at the broken mess. "Do you have any idea how much that costs?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," Nick stammered. "Oh, you didn't mean to," Todd sneered. "Well, I don't mean to pay people who can't do a basic job." Daniel clenched his fists. It wasn't the broken tiles that mattered to Todd. It was the chance to assert his dominance. Instead of helping clean up or offering guidance, he stood there berating Nick, ensuring every customer nearby heard the humiliation. Luis quietly handed Nick a broom, muttering, "Don't let him get to you, kid." But Daniel knew the damage had been done. This wasn't an accident. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem. And if Todd treated Nick like this in public, Daniel could only imagine how bad it got behind closed doors. The store's dysfunction reached a boiling point later that afternoon. Daniel was working in the stockroom trying to keep up with the chaotic inventory process when he heard a sharp cry of pain from the sales floor. He dropped the box he was holding and rushed out just in time to see a customer clutching her shoulder, a heavy box of power tools lying on the ground beside her. Several employees stood frozen, unsure of what to do. "What happened?" Daniel asked, stepping forward. Nick, who had been stalking nearby, looked pale. "She was reaching for a box on the top shelf," he stammered. "It must have been stacked wrong, it just fell." Daniel turned to look at the shelf, noticing immediately how poorly secured the heavy items were. It wasn't Nick's fault, the shelving was dangerously overloaded, clearly the result of rushed restocking and mismanagement. But before Daniel could say anything, Todd stormed onto the scene, his face twisted in irritation rather than concern. Oh, fantastic, Todd scoffed, folding his arms. This is just what we need. The woman, still rubbing her sore shoulder, looked at him in disbelief. That's your reaction? A box fell on me? And you're acting like it's an inconvenience to you? Todd exhaled sharply. Look, lady, you were the one reaching for it. Maybe don't grab things you can't handle. Daniel felt his blood pressure spike. Not an apology, not even an ounce of concern, just pure dismissal. I need to speak to your manager, the woman said, her voice shaking. You're looking at him, Todd replied, already bored of the conversation. Before the woman could respond, Daniel stepped in. Let's get you checked out, he said firmly, ignoring Todd. Do you need medical attention? The woman gave him a grateful look. I think I'll be okay, but I'm definitely reporting this. Todd rolled his eyes but didn't argue, probably because he figured no one would actually do anything about it. After the customer left, Todd turned his fury on Nick. This is what happens when you don't pay attention, he snapped. If you had stalked it right, this wouldn't have happened. Do you want to get us sued? Nick looked like he wanted to disappear. No excuses, Todd interrupted. I swear, some of you people are more trouble than you're worth. That was it. Daniel had seen enough. Todd had made it clear he wasn't just a bad manager, he was a liability. And now it was time for Daniel to take control. 5, the breaking point, and CEO's revelation, 500 words. Daniel had spent the past 2 days biting his tongue, observing and gathering evidence, but after witnessing Todd's complete disregard for both employee and customer safety, he knew it was time to act. He just needed the perfect moment. That moment arrived during the evening rush, when the store was at its busiest. Nick was once again at the register, visibly tense, his hands trembling as he scanned items. A long line of customers stretched in front of him, impatience growing with each passing second. Daniel saw it before it happened. A simple slip, a barcode misread, a slight delay. And just like that, Todd pounced. You've got to be kidding me, he barked, slamming his hand down on the counter. How hard is it to scan a damn barcode? Are you even paying attention? Nick flinched, his face turning red as customers watched uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the unfairness of the situation, but no one spoke up. No one ever did. Except Daniel. Slowly, he stepped out from behind a shelf, removing his employee name tag and slipping his cap off. The room didn't fall silent at first, until he pulled off his glasses and tucked them into his pocket. That's when Luis froze. That's when Nick's eyes widened, realization dawning across his face. Todd, still fuming, turned toward Daniel with irritation. What are you looking at? He snapped. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying authority. I was looking at you, Todd. Something about the way he said it made Todd hesitate, his brows knitting together in confusion. And who the hell are you to... I'm Daniel Shaw, Daniel cut in, his voice firm. CEO of this company. The store fell into absolute silence. Employees stopped what they were doing, customers looked up in shock, and Todd's face drained of color, his posture stiffened, his mouth opening slightly. For once, he was at a complete loss for words. Daniel took another step forward, his voice steady. And I've spent the last 2 days watching you berate employees, ignore safety hazards, and blame your team for mistakes caused by your own incompetence. Todd stammered, trying to recover. This isn't... Office, now. Daniel's tone left no room for argument. The weight of what was happening settled thick over the store. Employees exchanged wide-eyed looks, some of them gripping their workstations like they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Nick still stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Daniel glanced at him, offering the first reassuring look the kid had probably received in weeks. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel, leading a speechless, trembling Todd toward the manager's office for what was about to be the most important conversation of his career. The door to the manager's office clicked shut, leaving Daniel and Todd alone in the cramped space. The hum of the store continued outside, but here the reality of the situation was settling in fast. Todd, who had spent the last 2 days throwing his weight around, now stood rigid, his confidence cracking. All right, Todd started, attempting to regain some control. So, "You're the boss. What now? You gonna fire me?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, making Todd squirm under the weight of his own actions. Then he spoke. "You're done here?" Todd exhaled sharply, masking his panic with a scoff. Figures. Some big-shot CEO plays stockboy for 2 days and thinks he knows everything? Daniel remained unshaken. "I know enough," he said coolly. "I know that you've been running this store into the ground. I know that employees are afraid to speak up because they've learned that nothing changes. And I know that if I let you stay, this toxic environment will keep driving good workers away." Todd opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to defend himself. But Daniel was already reaching for the office phone. "Effective immediately, you're no longer the store manager," Daniel continued. "Security will escort you out. Your final paycheck will be processed, and an internal investigation will determine whether further action needs to be taken regarding your management history." Todd's jaw tightened. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. Without another word, he stormed out of the office. By the time Daniel stepped back onto the sales floor, the atmosphere had already changed. Employees stood frozen, watching, waiting. He met their gazes, then spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Todd is no longer your manager." A ripple of relief swept through the team. Some exchanged glances, others visibly relaxed, their postures loosening as if they had been carrying the weight of his presence for too long. Daniel turned to Luis, the most experienced and respected employee. "Starting today, you're interim manager." Luis's eyes widened. "Me?" "You've been keeping this store afloat," Daniel said. "It's time you actually got the authority to fix things." For the first time since he'd arrived, Daniel saw something new on his employees' faces. Hope. And this was just the beginning. With Todd gone, and Luis stepping into his new role as interim manager, the real work was just beginning. Firing one bad leader wouldn't fix everything overnight, but Daniel had no intention of walking away after making a bold statement. He had seen the damage firsthand: broken morale, unsafe working conditions, and a culture of fear. Now it was time to rebuild. Daniel spent the next hour making calls to his corporate team. First, he reached out to HR, launching a full investigation into how Todd had remained in his position despite numerous complaints. If there were similar cases in other locations, they needed to be dealt with immediately. Next, he contacted the regional manager, making it clear that leadership accountability was no longer optional. District managers who ignored reports of misconduct would also be held responsible. Back on the sales floor, employees were still processing the shift in leadership. Luis, though hesitant at first, had already begun talking to his team, not barking orders, but actually listening. Daniel stood back, observing as workers who once seemed defeated and fearful now spoke up about the real problems: stock shortages, broken equipment, understaffing. Nick, the young cashier who had been at the center of multiple incidents, approached Daniel cautiously. Daniel turned, offering a small nod. "Call me Daniel." Nick exhaled, still adjusting to the idea that he had just spent 2 days working alongside his company's CEO. I thought I was bad at this job," he admitted. "But it wasn't me, was it?" Daniel shook his head. "No, Nick. It was never you." The kid gave a small, relieved smile, and for Daniel, that moment solidified everything. This wasn't just about profit margins or company reputation. It was about the people who kept the business running, the employees who had been let down for too long. Before leaving, Daniel gathered the entire team in the break room. "Tomorrow morning, before the store opens, we're having a meeting," he announced. "I want every one of you there. We're going to talk about what needs to change, and I promise you, I'll listen." A quiet murmur passed through the team. This was new. This was different. As Daniel stepped outside, the evening air felt lighter than when he'd first arrived. The store wasn't magically fixed, but for the first time in years, it was on the right path. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a new era, and this time, no employee would be left unheard. The story of Daniel Shaw's undercover experience reveals a powerful lesson about leadership, accountability, and workplace culture. It highlights how a toxic manager like Todd can single-handedly destroy morale, drive employees away, and create an environment of fear. However, it also proves that real leadership isn't about control, it's about empowerment. Daniel learned that problems don't always show up in reports. By experiencing the daily struggles of his employees firsthand, he saw what numbers and emails could never fully capture: the exhaustion, the frustration, and the feeling of being unheard. His decision to step in, remove a toxic leader, and promote someone who truly cared set the foundation for real change. Another key takeaway is that people don't quit jobs, they quit bad bosses. Workers like Nick and Luis weren't failing because they were incapable. They were failing because they were never given the tools to succeed. Once leadership changed, confidence and efficiency improved. Ultimately, the story teaches that strong companies are built on respect, fairness, and listening to employees. Leadership isn't about demanding results, it's about creating an environment where people can thrive. And sometimes, the best way to fix a problem is to see it for yourself.